Some secrets don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole or how many years you let pass. Eli Cartwright learned that the hard way when his donkey wouldn't stop digging behind his barn. For 30 years, he'd lived alone in the Montana mountains, keeping to himself, away from towns and the ghosts of his past. His only companion was Betsy, a stubborn old donkey who'd been loyal through thick and thin. But lately, she'd taken to scratching at the same patch of dirt every single morning, braying until Eli came out. Finally, he grabbed his shovel and started digging. What he found wasn't gold or treasure. It was an iron chest with letters, maps, and a marshal's badge inside, from a lawman who vanished 30 years ago, the same year Eli disappeared into these mountains. What was in that chest that someone wanted buried forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Eli Cartwright sat on the edge of his porch, the iron chest resting between his boots like a sleeping dog. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern ridge, and the air still held that sharp bite that came with high mountain living. He'd pulled the chest from the ground an hour ago, and now it sat there rust-streaked and silent, holding secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Betsy stood 15 feet away, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes that donkeys have. She'd stopped her digging the moment he'd struck iron with his shovel, stopped braying too. Now she just stood there, patient as a Sunday sermon, as if her work was done and the rest was up to him. The chest wasn't large, maybe 2 feet long, a foot wide, constructed from iron plates that had been riveted together by someone who knew their trade. A heavy padlock had once secured it, but 30 years in the Montana soil had turned the lock to powder. Eli had pried it open with the tip of his shovel, the hinges screaming like a wounded animal. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the worst of the moisture out, were papers, letters from the look of them, maps, and resting on top of everything else, a marshal's badge, tarnished silver with an engraving he could barely make out in the dawn light. Eli reached down and lifted the badge, turning it over in his calloused fingers. The metal was cold, heavy with the authority that didn't diminish even after 3 decades underground. He held it up to catch the first rays of sunlight breaking over the ridge. Marshal James Hendricks, 1843. The name hit him like a fist to the chest. He knew that name. Knew it the way you know the smell of rain coming or the sound of a branch breaking under weight. It was buried somewhere in the back rooms of his memory, in places he'd locked up tight and thrown away the key. Betsy took 3 steps closer and nudged his shoulder with her nose. Eli reached up absently and scratched behind her ears, the way she liked. She'd been with him for 12 years now, bought off a rancher down in the valley who'd said she was too ornery to keep. Eli had recognized something in her stubbornness, a refusal to bend that matched his own nature. "You knew it was there, didn't you?" he said softly. "Somehow you knew." Betsy just blinked at him, then turned and wandered toward the water trough. Eli set the badge carefully on the porch boards and reached for the letters. There were 5 of them, each folded and addressed in a woman's careful handwriting. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words were still readable. He unfolded the first one, his hands steadier than he expected. "My dearest James," it began, "I pray this letter finds you safe, though I know the dangers you face daily. The boy is well. He asks about you often, wonders when you'll return. I tell him you're doing important work, keeping people safe. He's too young to understand the weight you carry, the choices you've had to make." Eli's eyes moved down the page. The letter spoke of ordinary things, weather, crops, a neighbor's wedding, but threaded through it all was a tension, a fear the writer tried to mask but couldn't quite hide. She mentioned "they" several times without explanation, as if the recipient would know exactly who "they" were. "Please be careful," the letter ended. "Please come home to us. All my love, Sarah." Eli folded it carefully and reached for the next one. This one was shorter, more urgent. The handwriting was the same, but shakier, as if written in haste. "James, they know about the boy. I don't know how, but they know. You have to move him. Tonight, if possible. I'm frightened, not for myself, but for him. He's innocent in all this. Please." James, please protect him. There was no signature on that one. The remaining letters followed the same pattern, a woman named Sarah writing to Marshal James Hendricks about a boy who needed protection, about unnamed threats, about fear that grew with each passing day. Eli set the letters aside and pulled out the maps. There were 3 of them, hand-drawn on what looked like surveyor's paper. The first showed property boundaries and landmarks he recognized: Copper Creek, the 3 standing stones on the North Ridge, the old mine shaft that had played out 20 years before he'd even arrived. The second map was more detailed, showing what appeared to be trails through the mountains, with notations about water sources and shelter. Someone had marked several locations with an X, though there was no legend to explain what the marks meant. The third map made his breath catch. It showed this property, his property, in careful detail. Every building, every fence line, every natural feature. And near the back corner, where the barn now stood, someone had drawn a small square and written 2 words beside it: Safe House. Eli stood up, the map still in his hands, and walked to the edge of the porch. The barn was visible from here, weathered grey wood that he'd repaired a dozen times over the years. Behind it, the ground sloped gently upward toward the tree line. That was where Betsy had been digging, where the chest had been buried. He'd built the barn himself 15 years ago, on the foundation of an older structure that had long since collapsed. He'd found the stone foundation and decided to use it, figuring whoever had laid it originally had chosen the spot for good reason: level ground, protected from the worst of the winter winds. Now he wondered what else might be buried there, what other secrets the ground might be holding. A sound pulled his attention back, the distant jingle of harness and the creak of wagon wheels. Eli folded the map and tucked it back into the chest, then carried the whole thing inside his cabin. He set it in the corner, covered it with a blanket, and stepped back outside just as a wagon came into view on the trail. Clara Morrison handled the reins with easy confidence, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She'd been bringing him supplies once a month for the past 8 years, ever since her husband had passed and she'd taken over his delivery route. She was a decade younger than Eli, somewhere in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a manner that was both warm and no-nonsense. "Morning." "Eli," she called out, pulling the wagon to a stop. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," he said, which was true enough. Clara climbed down with an agility that belied her years. "Well, I've got your flour and coffee. Some salt pork, too, though I know you prefer to hunt your own meat." She paused, studying him. "You look troubled." "Do I?" "You do." She began unloading supplies, stacking them on the porch. "Something on your mind?" Eli helped her with the heavier items, considering how much to say. Clara was trustworthy. He knew that from years of dealing with her. But trust was a muscle he hadn't exercised much in his life, and it felt stiff and unreliable now. "Been finding old things," he said finally. "Property's been here longer than I have. Makes a man wonder about who came before." Clara set down a sack of flour and dusted off her hands. "This land has history, that's for sure. Your father owned it before you, didn't he?" "He did, Ezra Cartwright. Good man from what I heard. Kept to himself like you do, but folks in town spoke well of him." Eli nodded. "His father, the man who'd raised him, taught him to survive in these mountains and died when Eli was barely 20. He'd inherited the property and kept up his father's tradition of solitude, asking few questions about what had come before. Now he wished he'd asked more. Clara, he said, the words coming out before he could reconsider them. You ever hear stories about a marshal who disappeared? Long time ago, maybe 30 years or more? Her hand stilled on a bag of coffee beans. Marshal Hendricks? So, she knew the name. That's the one. Everyone knows that story, Clara said. Or at least everyone who's been in these parts long enough. He vanished without a trace back in 43. Left behind a wife and... She paused. Why are you asking? Just curious. You know how it is. Long winter nights, a man's mind wanders. Clara didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. His wife was Sarah Hendricks. She lived in town for years after he disappeared, always hoping he'd come back. She passed away about 10 years ago. Sad story, really. She never remarried, never stopped wearing her wedding ring. Eli absorbed this, fitting it together with the letters. Sarah had written those words, had waited for a man who never returned. What was he investigating when he disappeared? Eli asked. Train robbery, if memory serves. Nasty business. A gang hit a railway shipment, killed a dozen people in the process. The marshal was close to catching them, or so the story goes. Then one day he just didn't come home. Clara finished unloading and leaned against the wagon. Why this sudden interest in old history? Like I said, curious. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Well, if you want to know more, the records are probably still in the marshal's office in town. Young Tom Brewster runs it now. He's a good man, takes his job seriously. Might do that, Eli said, though the thought of riding into town made his stomach tight. He hadn't been to Timber Ridge in 5 years, and before that, it had been another 3. Towns meant people, questions, the kind of attention he'd spent most of his life avoiding. Clara climbed back onto her wagon. You take care of yourself, Eli, and if you need anything before next month, you know where to find me. He watched her drive away, the wagon disappearing down the trail in a cloud of dust. When she was gone, he went back inside and uncovered the chest. The marshal's badge caught the light filtering through his window, and for a moment it almost looked polished. Eli picked it up again, turned it over in his hands. Marshal James Hendricks, who'd disappeared 30 years ago. Sarah Hendricks, who'd written letters about protecting a boy. A property that once housed something called a safe house. And Betsy, who dug up the past like she'd known exactly where to find it. Eli set the badge down and stared at it for a long time. Some part of him, the part that had chosen this isolated life, that had learned to ask no questions and expect no answers, wanted to put it all back in the ground and forget he'd ever found it. But another part, older and deeper, knew it was too late for that. The past had a way of refusing to stay buried, no matter how much dirt you piled on top of it. Outside, Betsy brayed once, sharp and insistent. Eli looked out the window and saw her standing near the barn, staring at the spot where the chest had been. I know, he said quietly. I know. Eli spent the rest of that day trying to work, but his mind kept drifting back to the chest. He split firewood until his shoulders ached, repaired a section of fence that didn't really need repairing, and checked his traps, even though he'd checked them the day before. Busy work, the kind of meaningless labor a man uses to avoid thinking about things he doesn't want to face. By evening, he gave up pretending and brought the chest back out to the porch. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if he'd been in the mood to appreciate them. He lit his oil lamp and settled into his chair, the letters spread across his lap. He read them again, slower this time, paying attention to details he'd missed in his first hurried examination. Sarah's handwriting was educated, careful. She'd been a schoolteacher, maybe, or the daughter of someone with means. The paper itself was good quality, the kind that cost money. The third letter mentioned a name he hadn't caught before. McKinnon. She'd written it only once, almost in passing. I pray they don't discover what James knows about the McKinnon business, but it was there. Unmistakable, Eli set the letter down and stared out at the darkening mountains. McKinnon. That was a name he knew, though not from 30 years ago. The McKinnon family owned half the territory these days. Mines, timber operations, even a stake in the railway. They were the kind of rich that made regular folks step aside when they walked down the street. He picked up the 4th letter, dated 2 weeks after the 3rd. This one was shorter, more desperate. James, I haven't heard from you in 6 days. Please send word that you're safe. The boy had nightmares again last night. He keeps asking when you'll come back for him. I don't know what to tell him anymore. Whatever you're doing, whatever evidence you're gathering, please be careful. These people have no conscience. They've already shown what they're willing to do. There was a water stain on the bottom of the page, smearing the last few words. Eli wondered if it was from moisture in the ground or from tears. The 5th and final letter was different. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. My love, if you're reading this, then I've failed. They came to the house today asking questions. I told them nothing, but they know I'm connected to you. I'm leaving tonight, taking the boy to your father as we planned. By the time you find this, we should be safe at the location marked on the map. The boy has what you need. He saw everything that night in the barn. His testimony is the key. Guard him with your life, James. He's innocent in all this. He's just a child who happened to see too much. I love you. I've always loved you. Come find us when it's safe. Eli's hands were shaking. He set the letter down carefully, as if it might crumble to dust at any moment. The boy. Sarah had written about a boy in every single letter. A boy who needed protection. A boy who'd witnessed something in a barn. A boy who'd been brought to your father. The words echoed in his mind like thunder in a canyon. Your father. James Hendrick's father, or... Eli stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped over. He went inside, moving with sudden purpose, and pulled an old trunk from under his bed. It was his father's trunk, the one Ezra had left him when he died. Eli had gone through it once, years ago, but he'd been young then, drowning in grief, and he hadn't paid much attention to what he'd found. Now, he dumped the contents onto his bed. Clothes, mostly. A few tools. A Bible with Ezra's name written inside the cover, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a small leather-bound book. Eli unwrapped it and found himself holding a journal. His father's journal from the look of the handwriting. He opened it to the first page. January 1843. The boy arrived tonight. James brought him after dark. Said it wasn't safe for him to stay in town. The child's frightened, barely speaks. James says he witnessed something terrible, something that could hang powerful men if it comes to light. I've agreed to keep him here until it's safe. The boy's name is... The rest of the sentence was crossed out, heavy black lines obscuring whatever name had been written there. Eli's heart was pounding now. He flipped through the pages, scanning his father's careful entries. February 1843. The boy is settling in. He helps with chores, doesn't complain. Still has nightmares. March 1843. James came by today. Says the investigation is getting dangerous. The McKinnon gang knows someone talked. April 1843. No word from James in 2 weeks. Sarah sent a message through the usual channels. She's worried. Then in May, the entries stopped. Just stopped, as if his father had decided there was nothing more worth recording. Or perhaps because whatever had happened was too dangerous to write down. Eli sat on the edge of his bed, the journal open in his hands, and tried to remember. Tried to pull up memories from a time so far back, they felt like someone else's life. He'd been young in 1843. How young? 5, 6. Those early years were a blur, fragments of images that didn't quite fit together. He remembered his father, solid and steady as a mountain. He remembered learning to trap and hunt, to read the weather and the land. He remembered a woman's voice, soft, singing a song he couldn't quite recall. Warm hands tucking him into bed. A face he couldn't see clearly anymore, lost to the fog of time. And before that, or was it during, a feeling of fear, of hiding, of his father's voice, low and urgent. Don't tell anyone. Don't ever tell anyone who you were before. Eli closed the journal and pressed his palms against his eyes. The pieces were there, scattered like a broken mirror, but he couldn't quite make them fit together into a complete picture. A sound from outside pulled him from his thoughts. Betsy was braying, that sharp alarm call she made when something wasn't right. Eli grabbed his rifle from beside the door and stepped onto the porch. 2 riders were coming up the trail, moving slowly in the twilight. They were still 100 yards out, but even at that distance, Eli could tell they weren't locals. The horses were too fine, the saddles too expensive. City men, or at least men with city money. He waited, rifle held loosely but ready as they approached. When they were close enough to see clearly, he called out, "That's far enough. State your business." The lead rider pulled up about 30 feet from the porch. He was maybe 40, well-dressed in a suit that had no place on a mountain trail. Clean-shaven, with the kind of smooth hands that had never done hard labor. The man behind him was younger, rougher, with the look of someone paid to handle problems. "Mr. Cartwright," the first man said. His voice was smooth, educated. "I hope we're not intruding. My name is Voigt. I represent some business interests in the territory. You're on private property, Eli said. Speak your piece and move on. Voight smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. We'll be brief. I'm here on behalf of a client who has an interest in this land, specifically in the mineral rights. We understand your family has owned this property for quite some time, and we'd like to make you an offer. Not for sale. I understand your hesitation, but I assure you, our offer is generous. Very generous. Enough to set you up comfortably anywhere you'd like to live. I said it's not for sale. Voight's smile faded slightly. Mr. Cartwright, I don't think you understand. My client is quite determined. It would be in your best interest to get off my land. The younger man's hand moved toward his hip, but Voight raised a hand to stop him. There's no need for hostility. We're simply businessmen trying to conduct business. Business is done, Eli said. You've got 10 seconds to turn those horses around. Voight studied him for a long moment, and Eli saw something calculating in that gaze. Something that suggested this wasn't really about mineral rights at all. Very well, Voight said finally. We'll leave. But Mr. Cartwright, I should mention, we know about your family's history. We know about the things that happened here 30 years ago. If you found anything of historical interest, anything at all, it might be wise to share that information. For your own safety, Eli felt his grip tighten on the rifle. That sounds like a threat. Not at all. Simply friendly advice. These mountains can be dangerous. Accidents happen, particularly to men who live alone. Voight pulled his horse around. Think about our offer, Mr. Cartwright. We'll be in touch. The two men rode off into the gathering darkness. Eli stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared from sight. His hands were steady, his breathing calm, but inside something had shifted. These men knew about the past. They knew he'd found something, which meant whatever was in that chest, whatever secrets it held, someone wanted them badly enough to send threats into the mountains. Eli went back inside and looked at the journal, the letters, the maps spread across his table. The marshal's badge caught the lamplight, glinting like a promise or a warning. He thought about the boy his father had protected, about Marshal Hendricks, who'd vanished, about Sarah, who'd written those desperate letters and never saw her husband again. And he thought about Voight's words. We know about your family's history. Somewhere in these documents, in these fragments of the past, was a truth that powerful people wanted to keep buried. A truth worth threatening an old man over. Eli picked up the badge and turned it over in his hands. Marshal James Hendricks had tried to uncover that truth 30 years ago, and it had cost him everything. Now, whether he wanted to or not, Eli was following in his footsteps. Outside, Betsy had gone quiet. The mountains settled into their usual. Evening sounds, wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the creek running over stones. But beneath it all, Eli could feel something else. A tension like the air before a storm. The past wasn't done with him yet. Not by a long shot. Eli reached his cabin as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Betsy greeted him with her usual stubborn affection, nudging his arm as he dismounted. He took care of Buck first, unsaddled him, rubbed him down, made sure he had fresh water and feed. A man took care of his animals before himself. That was one of the first lessons Ezra had taught him. Ezra, his father, the man who'd raised him, protected him, hidden him from whatever danger had killed Marshal Hendricks and driven Sarah into exile. Eli wondered, not for the first time that day, how much of what he remembered about his childhood was real and how much was the story Ezra had constructed to keep him safe. Inside the cabin, he spread the map across his table once more and set the compass beside it. The coordinates etched into the brass were clear now that he knew to look for them. He'd need to plot them against the landmarks shown on the map, figure out where his father had marked. But first, he needed to understand what he was looking for. He returned to the chest and carefully removed everything, laying each item out in order. The badge, the 5 letters, the 3 maps, and beneath it all, wrapped in what remained of the oilcloth, something he'd missed in his initial examination. A Folded piece of paper, yellow with age and brittle at the edges. He unfolded it with care, and his breath caught. It was a wanted poster, the kind that used to hang in every marshal's office and post office in the territory. 5 faces stared back at him, rendered in the crude but effective style of frontier sketch artists. Wanted for murder and robbery, the text proclaimed. The McKinnon Gang, reward $5,000, $5,000. In 1843, that was a fortune, enough to make men risk everything to claim it. Eli studied the faces. The largest sketch in the center showed a hard-faced man in his 40s with deep-set eyes and a cruel mouth. Below it, a name, Clayton McKinnon Sr., leader. The other 4 were younger, harder to distinguish from one another in the rough sketches. Brothers, maybe, or cousins. The caption listed their crimes in stark detail. Robbery of the Western Railway, company shipment, murder of 12 people including the train crew and passengers, assault on a federal marshal. This was what Marshal Hendricks had been chasing. These were the men who'd killed him. Eli looked closer at the faces, trying to see if any of them sparked recognition. They were strangers to him, or at least he thought they were. But something about the sketch of Clayton McKinnon nagged at him, some quality in the eyes that felt familiar. He set the poster down and picked up one of Sarah's letters again, the one that mentioned what we did to protect him. The boy had seen something. The boy could testify if Eli was that boy, and every piece of evidence pointed to that conclusion. Then, what had he seen? Where had he seen it? He closed his eyes and tried to remember. Tried to push past the comfortable memories of life with Ezra, past the mountain lessons and quiet evenings, back to whatever had come before. Fragments surfaced, disconnected and hazy. A woman's voice singing, the smell of cooking meat. A barn, large and dark, with light filtering through the slats in the walls. Voices, angry and urgent. The metallic taste of fear in his mouth as he pressed himself into a corner, trying to be invisible, and a face glimpsed through those slats. A man's face, twisted with rage as he raised a gun. Eli's eyes snapped open. His heart was racing, his hands clenched tight on the edge of the table. The memory, if it was a memory and not just his imagination filling in the gaps, had the sharp clarity of truth. He'd been there. He'd seen something terrible. A sound from outside pulled him from his thoughts. Hoofbeats coming fast. Eli grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, keeping to the side where he couldn't be seen from the trail. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. For a moment, Eli thought it was Voight and his man returning. But then he recognized the horses. One of them was Clara's old mare. He set the rifle aside and opened the door. Clara was riding hard, which was unusual for her. The man with her was Tom Brewster, the young marshal, looking serious and alert. They pulled up at his porch, both horses breathing hard from the ride. "Eli," Clara said, slightly breathless. "Tom needs to talk to you. It's important." Tom dismounted, his hand resting on his gun belt out of habit rather than threat. "Mr. Cartwright, I'm sorry to intrude on your property, but we need to have a conversation. A serious one. About what? About the men who came to see you, about Marshal Hendricks, about who you really are." Tom's eyes were steady, neither accusing nor judgmental. "I did some checking after you left. Old records, old stories. And I think you need to tell me the truth before someone else gets hurt." Eli felt his jaw tighten. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Tom stepped closer, but not threateningly. "After you left, I went through that file more carefully, found some notes tucked in the back, things that weren't in the official report. Notes about a witness, a boy who saw the McKinnon gang murder a railway agent in their barn, a boy who disappeared the same time Marshal Hendricks started investigating." Clara dismounted as well, moving to stand beside Tom. "Eli, if you're in danger, we want to help. But we can't help if you don't trust us." Eli looked at them both. Clara, who'd been bringing him supplies for 8 years without asking questions, and Tom, who'd only met him today but who had the kind of honest face that suggested he meant what he said. Trust. That word again. The thing he'd spent 30 years avoiding. "Come inside," he said finally. "Both of you. This is going to take some time to explain." They followed him into the cabin. Tom's eyes went immediately to the table, to the maps and letters and the wanted poster spread across it. His hand moved toward his gun, then stopped. "Is that—" "It is," Eli said. "The original poster for the McKinnon gang, along with letters from Sarah Hendricks and maps showing where they hid the witness." He took a breath. The witness was me. I was the boy. Clara's hand went to her mouth. Tom just stared at him, processing the information. "I don't remember all of it," Eli continued. "My father, the man who raised me, Ezra Cartwright, he must have worked with Marshal Hendricks to keep me hidden. I grew up thinking I was just his son, just a mountain boy learning to survive. But these past few days, things have been coming back. Memories, pieces of a life I didn't know I had." Tom picked up the wanted poster, studying it. "You saw them commit murder." "I think so. I was just a child, maybe 5 or 6. I remember a barn, voices, someone being shot. Then everything after that is confused until I woke up here, in these mountains, with Ezra telling me this was home. And now the McKinnons have sent men to find you," Tom said. "Or rather, to find any evidence that still exists. Clayton McKinnon Jr. runs the family business now," Clara added quietly. "He's spent years building up the family name, making them respectable. If it came out that his father and uncles were mass murderers, it would destroy everything," Tom finished. "The business, the reputation, probably land him in prison as an accessory if he's been helping cover it up." Eli nodded. "The man who came here, Voight, he as much as threatened me. Told me accidents happen in the mountains to men who live alone." Tom's jaw tightened. "That's a crime right there. Intimidation, threats. I can arrest him for that, and what good would that do?" Eli asked. "McKinnon has money, lawyers. Voight would be out before sunset, and then they'd know for sure I'm not going to cooperate. So what are you going to do?" Clara asked. Eli picked up the compass, turned it over to show them the coordinates. "Find what my father hid. He left me a trail, markers that would mean something to me if I knew to look for them. These coordinates lead somewhere important. The evidence," Tom said. "Your testimony, probably. Documents, maybe even physical proof of what happened. And if we find it," Eli said, "we can finally bring the McKinnons to justice. Not just for what they did 30 years ago, but for what they're doing now, sending threats, trying to bury the truth." Tom looked at Clara, then back at Eli. "Then we find it together. You're not doing this alone. This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is. I'm the marshal. Justice is always my fight." Tom's voice was firm. "Besides, Hendricks was one of us. One of the Brotherhood. If his case can finally be closed, if his name can be cleared, then that's worth doing right." Eli felt something in his chest loosen slightly. He'd been alone for so long, keeping everyone at arm's length, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside him, to have allies. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning we follow the coordinates. See where they lead." "I'm coming too," Clara said. Both men turned to look at her. She stood with her arms crossed, her chin lifted in a way that suggested argument would be pointless. "Clara," Eli started, "don't you dare tell me it's too dangerous. I've lived in this territory for 60 years. I've survived winters that killed grown men, outlaws that burned half the town, and burying a husband I loved more than life itself. I can handle a ride into the mountains." Tom smiled slightly. "She's got a point. Besides," Clara continued, "someone needs to keep you two from doing something stupid. Men always think they can solve everything with guns and bravado. Sometimes you need a cooler head." Eli found himself almost smiling. "Almost. All right. We leave at first light. Bring supplies for 2 days, just in case. And weapons. If Voight's men are watching, they'll follow." They agreed on the plan, and Tom and Clara rode back toward town as darkness settled over the mountains. Eli stood on his porch, watching them disappear down the trail. And for the first time in 30 years, he didn't feel quite so alone. Inside, Betsy had wandered close to the cabin, as if sensing something important was happening. Eli walked over and scratched behind her ears. "You started all this," he told her. "I hope you know that." She just looked at him with those dark, patient eyes, and somewhere in Eli's chest, Something that had been locked tight for 3 decades started, very slowly to open. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of mountain morning where every sound carried for miles, and the air tasted clean enough to hurt your lungs. Eli had been awake since before first light, packing and repacking his saddlebags, with the careful attention of a man who knew that forgotten supplies could mean the difference between life and death in the high country. He'd laid out the items from the chest one more time, studying them by lamplight. The badge, the letters, the maps, the wanted poster, and tucked in the very bottom of the chest, in a corner he'd somehow missed before, a hidden compartment revealed itself when he'd pressed against what he thought was solid wood. Inside that compartment, wrapped in waxed canvas, was a leather journal. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he pulled it out. The leather was good quality, well maintained despite its age. On the cover, embossed in fading gold letters, property of Marshal J. Hendricks. This was it, the Marshal's personal record. The real investigation notes that Tom had mentioned, the ones that had disappeared with Hendricks. Somehow, they'd ended up in this chest, buried behind Eli's barn. He opened it carefully. The first entry was dated March 1843, written in a firm, careful hand. Today I received word of a witness to the McKinnon gang's activities. A child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, who was present when they murdered railway agent Thomas Fletcher in their barn. The child's mother, Mary Marcus, was their cook. She got the boy out before they could silence him, but she paid with her life the next day. Ruled an accident, a fall downstairs, but I know better. They killed her, Mary Marcus. The name hit Eli like a physical blow. His mother? He'd had a mother named Mary, and she died protecting him. He read on, his eyes moving faster across the pages as the Marshal's investigation unfolded. Hendricks had been methodical, careful, documenting every piece of evidence he gathered. Witness statements from townspeople who'd seen the gang members near the train depot before the robbery. Financial records showing unexplained wealth flowing into the McKinnon businesses right after the heist. Testimony from a railway clerk who'd been coerced into providing information about shipment schedules, and throughout it all, references to the boy and the witness and young Marcus. The journal detailed how Hendricks had worked with Eli Cartwright to hide the child in the mountains, how they'd agreed that the boy's only chance at survival was to disappear completely, to become someone else. How Ezra had promised to raise him as his own son, to never speak of what had come before. The final entries grew more urgent, more fearful. April 28th, 1843. They know I'm close. Someone in town is feeding them information. I've moved Sarah and the important documents to safety. The boy remains with Ezra. That location is still secure. Tomorrow I ride to confront Clayton McKinnon directly. I have enough evidence now to hang them all. The boy's testimony, combined with the ledgers and witness statements, will be sufficient for conviction. April 29th, 1843. This will be my last entry. If I don't return from Devil's Pass tonight, then Ezra knows what to do. The boy has what I need hidden, where only someone who's learned Ezra's lessons could find it. Coordinates marked on the compass, locations taught through their games. Smart boy, brave boy. I pray he grows up safe and never has to remember what he's seen. The journal ended there. No more entries. Hendricks had gone to Devil's Pass and never come back. Eli closed the journal and sat in the pre-dawn darkness, trying to process what he'd learned. His mother had saved him. The marshal had died trying to bring her killers to justice. And Ezra had spent the rest of his life protecting a child who wasn't even his own blood. Also that someday, when the time was right, the truth could come out. Outside, he heard the sound of approaching horses. He tucked the journal into his jacket and stepped onto the porch as Tom and Clara rode up through the morning mist. Tom was dressed for rough country, sturdy clothes, a rifle in his saddle scabbard, saddlebags that looked properly packed. Clara wore men's riding trousers and a heavy coat, and she carried her late husband's Winchester with the ease of someone who knew how to use it. Found something else, Eli said without preamble, and showed them the journal. They read it together, their faces growing more serious with each page. When they finished, Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your mother was a hero," she said softly. "She was a cook who got caught in something terrible," Eli replied. "And she paid for it with her life. That doesn't make her sacrifice any less meaningful." Clara touched his arm gently. "She saved you, and now you have the chance to finish what she and the marshal started." Tom closed the journal and handed it back. "This changes things. With the journal and whatever physical evidence you hid as a child, we'd have enough to prosecute. Even 30 years later, murder has no statute of limitations. First, we have to find it," Eli said. He pulled out the compass and the map. "The coordinates lead northeast, about 2 miles into the high country. There's an old landmark there, a rock formation called Eagle's Perch. I remember Ezra taking me there when I was young, teaching me to read the stones." "I know the place," Clara said. "My husband and I used to ride up there sometimes. Beautiful view, but the trail's treacherous. Especially this time of year, could still be snow in the high passes. Then we'd better get moving." Tom mounted his horse. "The longer we wait, the more time we give Voight to figure out what we're doing." They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, turning the frost on the grass into a field of diamonds. Betsy watched them go, and Eli could have sworn she looked satisfied, as if this was what she'd been waiting for all along. The trail climbed steadily, winding through stands of pine and aspen that were just beginning to show their spring color. The air grew thinner, colder, and their breath formed clouds in front of their faces. Eli led the way, following paths he knew by instinct more than memory, the compass in his hand confirming their direction. They were an hour into the ride when Tom, who'd been watching their back trail, pulled his horse up short. "We've got company," he said quietly. Eli turned to look. There, perhaps a quarter-mile behind them, barely visible through the trees, were 2 riders. "Could be anyone," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Could be," Tom agreed. "But I don't believe in coincidences." Eli studied the distant figures. Too far away to identify, but something about the way they moved, the quality of their horses, suggested these weren't local ranchers or trappers. "Voight's men," he said. "Can we outrun them?" Clara asked. "Not in this terrain, and not for 2 miles uphill." Eli looked ahead, calculating distances and possibilities. "We stay on course. If they want to follow, let them. But we get to Eagle's Perch first." They pushed on, moving as quickly as the trail would allow. Behind them, the 2 riders matched their pace, neither closing the distance nor falling back. They were being tracked, and whoever was doing it wanted them to know it. "They're herding us," Tom said after another half hour. "Letting us lead them right to the evidence." "I know." Eli's jaw was tight. "But we don't have a choice. We find it, we secure it, and then we deal with them." The trail grew steeper, rockier. They had to dismount and lead the horses through sections where the path narrowed to barely more than a ledge. Below them, the valley spread out like a map, the town of Timber Ridge just visible in the distance. Clara stumbled once on the loose rock, and Eli caught her arm. "I'm fine," she said, but her breathing was labored. She wasn't as young as she used to be, and this climb was hard even for men in their prime. "We can rest," Eli started. "We can't." She pointed back down the trail. The 2 riders had closed the distance, were now maybe 10 minutes behind them. "They're pushing us. We rest, they catch up." She was right. They kept moving. Another hour brought them to a small plateau where the trail forked. One path continued up toward Eagle's Perch. The other led down into a narrow canyon, a shortcut that Eli remembered from his youth, but one that was dangerous even in good conditions. "Which way?" Tom asked. Eli consulted the compass, checking the coordinates against his memory of the land. "Straight up. Another mile, maybe less." They took the upper trail. Behind them, the riders had reached the plateau and stopped. Eli could see them now, 2 men on horseback watching. One of them raised something to his face. "Binoculars, most likely. They know where we're going," Clara said. "Let them know." Eli's voice was harder than he intended. "They want this evidence. They're going to have to take it from us." Tom checked his rifle, making sure a round was chambered. "I'm a federal marshal. They attack us. It's assault on a law officer. That's 20 years hard time, minimum." You think they care about that? Eli asked. They're already accessories to murder. They're playing for everything now. The truth of that hung in the air between them as they climbed the final stretch. The trail wound through a narrow defile between two massive rock faces, then opened suddenly onto a broad shelf of stone that jutted out from the mountainside, like the prow of a ship, Eagle's Perch. Eli had been here before, years ago, learning to read landmarks and use the compass. He remembered Ezra pointing out the way the rocks formed natural markers, how a surveyor could use them to plot coordinates with precision. Now he stood there, the compass in his hand, and tried to remember where a frightened 5-year-old boy would have hidden something precious, something that could bring down murderers and avenge his mother's death. The two riders appeared at the mouth of the defile. They'd closed the distance faster than Eli had expected, and now they sat their horses in silence, blocking the only way down. One of them was Voight. The other was the rough-looking younger man who'd accompanied him on his first visit to Eli's cabin. "Mr. Cartwright," Voight called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "I was hoping we could talk like reasonable men." "Seems we're all after the same thing." Tom stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "I'm Deputy Marshal Tom Brewster. You're trespassing and engaging in intimidation. Turn around and ride back to town, and we'll forget this happened." Voight smiled, but it was a cold expression. "I don't think so, Marshal. See, my employer has a great deal invested in making sure certain historical matters stay buried. And you three are digging in places you shouldn't. Your employer is going to prison," Tom said flatly. "We have evidence, testimony, everything we need to prove the McKinnon gang's crimes. You have old papers and the ravings of a man who doesn't even remember his own childhood." Voight dismounted, and his companion did the same. "That won't hold up in any court." "Then why are you here?" Clara asked. Her voice was steady, but Eli could see her knuckles white on the Winchester's stock. "If it's all just old papers and ravings, why risk following us up here?" Voight's smile faded. "Because loose ends bother my employer. And you, Mr. Cartwright, are a very troublesome loose end." His hand moved toward his gun, and the morning erupted into violence. Tom drew faster than Eli expected, his gun clearing leather in a smooth motion that spoke of practice and training. "Oh, don't!" Voight froze, his hand still inches from his weapon. His companion had stopped moving as well, both men reassessing the situation. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," Voight said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "The mistake is yours. Hands where I can see them." "Both of you," they complied slowly, raising their hands to shoulder height. Eli kept his rifle trained on them, while Tom moved forward to disarm them. 2 pistols and a knife hit the ground with a clatter. "Now," Tom said, stepping back. "You're going to turn around and walk back down that trail. When you get to town, you're going to keep walking until you're out of my jurisdiction. And if I ever see you threatening citizens again, I'll arrest you for assault with intent." Voight's eyes were cold. "My employer, your employer can take his concerns to the territorial court like everyone else. The law applies to rich men same as poor ones. You're naive if you believe that. Maybe, but I'm the one with the badge and the gun. So right now, my opinion's the only one that matters." Tom gestured with his pistol. "Get moving." For a moment, Eli thought Voight would refuse, thought he'd call Tom's bluff and force the situation into bloodshed. But after a long, tense silence, Voight lowered his hands and walked to his horse. "This isn't over," he said, mounting up. "Not even close. It is for today." They watched as Voight and his companion rode back down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Tom waited until they were out of sight before holstering his weapon. "They'll be back," Clara said quietly. "I know. But we bought some time." Tom turned to Eli. "Find what you came for, fast." Eli was already moving, compass in hand, using the rock formations to triangulate the coordinates. The numbers etched on the brass pointed to a specific location on the perch's western edge, where a distinctive arrangement of stones created a natural marker. He'd been here before. He remembered it now with startling clarity. Ezra kneeling beside him, teaching him to count the stones, to remember the pattern. "Someday," his father had said, "you might need to find this place again." Someday it might be important, Ezra had known that eventually the past would catch up, and Eli would need to remember. The stones were still there, weathered by 30 years of wind and rain, but unmistakable in their arrangement. 3 flat rocks stacked in a specific pattern, with a 4th stone, smaller, rounder, set to the northwest. Eli knelt and began moving the stones. Beneath the 4th one, the ground was softer than it should be, disturbed at some point in the distant past, and never fully settled. He dug with his hands, Clara and Tom watching. 6 inches down, his fingers struck something solid, something metal. It was a box, roughly the size of a large book, constructed from tin with a waterproof seal, the kind of container a surveyor might use to protect documents in the field. Eli pulled it free and brushed the dirt away. His hands were shaking again, and he had to take a breath to steady them before opening the seal. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were papers, documents, carefully folded and preserved. And resting on top of them, a small object that made Eli's breath catch, a child's toy. A tin soldier, hand-painted in red and blue, the colors faded but still visible. He'd seen it before, held it before. It had been his. What is it? Clara asked softly. Mine, Eli said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. This was mine when I was before. He set the soldier carefully aside and lifted out the papers. The first was a child's drawing, crude stick figures rendered in pencil on rough paper. But the scene it depicted was clear enough. A barn, men with guns, a figure lying on the ground. In the corner, in a child's uncertain handwriting, what I saw. Elijah Marcus, age 6. The second document was more formal, a notarized statement signed by Marshal James Hendricks, attesting that the drawing had been made by the witness Elijah Marcus in his presence, and that the child had verbally described the events of March 15, 1843, in which he witnessed the murder of railway agent Thomas Fletcher by members of the McKinnon gang. There were more papers beneath. Death certificates. Mary Marcus, age 28, cause of death, accidental fall. Thomas Fletcher, age 42, cause of death, gunshot wound. 2 other names Eli didn't recognize. Both ruled accidental deaths, both dated within weeks of the McKinnon gang's train robbery. And at the bottom of the stack, a leather-bound ledger. Tom lifted it out reverently, opening it with care. Inside were columns of numbers, dates, names. Payments made and received. Bribes from the look of it. This is it, Tom said, his voice tight. This is the proof. McKinnon paid off half the territorial government, judges, sheriffs, even the land office clerk. He flipped through more pages. It's all here. Every transaction, every dirty deal. Clara picked up one of the death certificates. These people didn't die accidentally. They were murdered to protect the gang. And no one investigated, because the people who should have been investigating were on McKinnon's payroll. Tom closed the ledger. With this and Eli's testimony, we can reopen every one of these cases. We can bring them all to justice. Eli was still holding the tin soldier, staring at it. Memories were flooding back now, sharp and clear and painful. He remembered his mother giving it to him, remembered carrying it everywhere. Remembered clutching it in his hand as he hid in that barn and watched terrible men do terrible things. He remembered crying for her afterward, and a tall man with kind eyes, Marshal Hendricks, kneeling beside him and promising that justice would come. We need to move, Tom said, tucking the ledger into his saddlebag. Get this evidence somewhere safe before Voight comes back with reinforcements. They gathered everything quickly, packing the documents with care. Eli slipped the tin soldier into his pocket. It was evidence, yes, but it was also something more. A connection to the boy he'd been, to the mother who'd died protecting him. As they prepared to mount their horses, Clara suddenly grabbed Eli's arm. Listen, he heard it then, the sound of multiple riders coming fast up the trail. Not 2 riders this time, more, many more. They didn't leave, Tom said, his face grim. They went for help. Voight appeared at the mouth of the defile, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were 5 more men, all armed, all with the look of hired muscle. Men who'd do whatever they were paid to do and not lose sleep over it. I told you this wasn't over, Voight called out. Now you're going to hand over that evidence, and you're going to do it peacefully, or we're going to take it from your corpses. Either way, my employer gets what he wants." Tom's hand moved toward his gun, but Eli caught his wrist. "There's too many. We can't fight them all. So what do we do?" Eli looked around the perch, taking in the geography with a trapper's eye. The defile was the only easy way down, but there was another route, a narrow ledge that ran along the cliff face, barely wide enough for a horse, that led to a steep descent into the canyon below. He'd used it once, as a young man, when a bear had driven him up here and he'd needed an escape. It was dangerous, especially for people who didn't know the mountains. But it was a way out. "We run," he said, and before anyone could argue, he mounted Buck and spurred toward the ledge, Clara and Tom racing to follow, and the gunfire started behind them. The ledge was narrower than Eli remembered, crumbling in places where time and weather had worn the stone away. Buck's hooves scattered rocks over the edge, and Eli heard them clatter down the cliff face for what seemed like forever before hitting bottom. Behind them, gunfire echoed off the rocks, but the angle was wrong for Voight's men to get a clear shot. They'd have to follow the ledge single file, and that would slow them down or force them to find another way around, which would take even longer. "Keep moving," Eli called back to Tom and Clara. "Don't look down, just trust your horse." The ledge curved around a massive rock outcropping, taking them temporarily out of sight of their pursuers. Eli used those precious seconds to scan ahead, looking for the place where the ledge widened, and began its descent into the canyon. There, another 50 yards. They could make it. Clara's horse stumbled on loose rock, and for a heart-stopping moment, Eli thought both horse and rider would go over the edge. But the mare caught herself, and Clara held on with the skill of someone who'd been riding since childhood. They reached the descent point, just as Voight and his men appeared on the ledge behind them. More gunfire, and this time a bullet sparked off the rock near Tom's head. "Go!" Tom shouted, returning fire to buy them time. The trail down was steep, switchbacking through stands of pine and loose scree. The horses half slid, half ran, their riders clinging to saddle horns and praying their mounts didn't lose their footing. Eli reached the canyon floor first and wheeled Buck around, rifle ready. Clara came down seconds later, her face pale but determined. Tom was third, and as he hit level ground, Eli could see blood on his left arm. "You're hit!" "Just grazed me. Keep moving." They rode hard down the canyon, following the creek that ran along its bottom. The water would mask their tracks for a while, buy them precious time. Behind them, Voight's men were descending the trail but carefully. They'd seen what nearly happened to Clara's horse and weren't about to take the same risk at speed. "Where does this canyon lead?" Tom asked, his voice tight with pain. "Eventually hooks back toward town. But there's a place about a mile down where we can hide the evidence." Eli had already made the decision. "We split up. Clara, you take the documents and ledger. Tom, you go with her. I'll lead them away." "No." Clara's voice was flat. "We stay together." "She's right," Tom said. "We split up. They'll just hunt us down one at a time." "They want me," Eli said. "I'm the witness. You two are just obstacles. You take the evidence and get to town. Get it to the territorial marshal. I'll keep them busy long enough for you to get away." "Eli, this isn't a debate." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the tin box, thrusting it toward Clara. "Take it. My testimony doesn't matter if the documents don't survive." "You know I'm right." Clara took the box, but her eyes were bright with tears. "You'd better make it back, you stubborn old fool." "Plan to." Eli managed something close to a smile. "Been shot at before." "Still here, aren't I?" Tom gripped his shoulder. "There's a line shack about 3 miles northwest of town. Old Mackenzie place. Clara knows where it is. You make it out of this. You head there. We'll wait for you. And if I don't make it, you will." Tom's voice was firm. "Marshal Hendricks trusted you to survive this long. Don't prove him wrong now." They split up where the canyon forked, Clara and Tom going left while Eli went right, making sure his trail was obvious enough to follow. He heard Voight's men reach the canyon floor minutes later, heard them shouting as they tried to figure out which way to go. Eli fired a shot in the air, not at them, just a clear signal of which direction he'd gone. Then he spurred Buck into a gallop, leading them deeper into the mountains. The chase went on for hours. Eli used every trick Ezra had taught him, doubling back, riding through streams, leaving false trails. But Voight's men were persistent, and they knew these mountains better than he'd expected. Every time he thought he'd lost them, they'd appear again, pushing him farther from town, farther from help. By afternoon, Buck was exhausted, his flanks heaving. Eli was bone-tired himself, his shoulder aching from an old wound that always flared up when he overdid it. He couldn't keep running forever. Time to make a stand. He found a defensible position, a cluster of boulders near the tree line with good sight lines in all directions. He dismounted, gave Buck a pat of gratitude, and took up position with his rifle. They came an hour before sunset, 6 riders moving cautiously through the trees. They'd learned from the chase that Eli wasn't helpless, that he knew how to use the terrain and his weapons. Cartwright. Voight's voice echoed through the gathering dusk. This is pointless. You can't win. Give yourself up and I promise you won't be harmed. Eli didn't bother responding. Promises from men like Voight were worth less than dust. You don't even know the full story. Voight tried again. Don't know what you're really protecting. That got Eli's attention. He stayed quiet, but he was listening now. You think this is about a 30-year-old train robbery? Voight laughed, and there was something ugly in the sound. That's just the beginning, Cartwright. The McKinnons have been covering up crimes for 3 decades. Murders, land theft, bribery, corruption that goes all the way to the territorial governor. That ledger you found, it's not just about the train robbery. It's about everything that came after. Eli's grip tightened on his rifle. Everything that came after. 30 years of crimes, all built on the foundation of that first massacre. And you know the best part. Voight continued. You were supposed to be the first loose end they tied up. A 6-year-old kid who saw too much. But Marshal Hendricks got you out before they could kill you. And then you disappeared so completely they thought you were dead. Clayton McKinnon Jr. grew up thinking the witness was long gone, that his family's secrets were safe. Voight stepped into the open, hands raised to show he was unarmed. A bold move, or a stupid one, but then your donkey started digging, he said, and you found that chest. And suddenly, the one witness who could bring down an empire turns out to be alive after all. You can understand why that made some people nervous. Nervous enough to kill, Eli called out. Again, if necessary. But it doesn't have to come to that. Voight took another step forward.
Work with us, Cartwright.
Say you don't remember anything, that you were too young, too traumatized. We can make it worth your while. Enough money to live comfortably anywhere you want. A new identity, if you prefer. Just walk away, like Marshal Hendricks walked away. Hendricks was a true believer, one of those men who thought justice mattered more than survival. Look where it got him, dead in a canyon, and for what? The people he was trying to protect didn't even know his name. Eli thought about the letters from Sarah, about his mother, Mary Marcus, who'd saved him at the cost of her own life, about Ezra, who'd raised another man's son because it was the right thing to do. They knew, he said quietly. The people who mattered knew. Sentiment won't keep you alive, maybe not, but it'll let me die knowing I did the right thing. He raised his rifle, and Voight dove for cover as the other men opened fire. The battle was sharp and brutal. Eli used his position well, making every shot count, forcing them to take cover and advance slowly, but there were 6 of them, and 1 of him. And eventually numbers would tell. A bullet clipped the rock next to his head, showering him with stone fragments. Another hit his rifle stock, splintering the wood. He switched to his pistol, but the range was too far for accuracy. They were closing in, moving from cover to cover, and he was running out of ammunition. This was it. This was where his story ended. Just like Marshal Hendricks' story had ended in Devil's Pass. He thought about Clara and Tom, hoped they'd made it to town with the evidence, hoped his death wouldn't be for nothing. Then, in the fading light, he saw something that made his heart stop. A photograph lying in the dirt near his feet. It must have fallen from his jacket when he'd taken up position. The photograph from the journal. The one showing Marshal Hendricks, Ezra, a young woman and a small boy. Eli picked it up. stared at it, and for the first time really looked at the faces. The woman was his mother, Mary Marcus. He could see that now, see the resemblance in the eyes and the shape of the mouth. The boy was him, Elijah Marcus, before he became Eli Cartwright. But it was the men that made his breath catch. Marshal Hendricks stood proud in his uniform, badge gleaming on his chest. And beside him, hand on the boy's shoulder, was Ezra Cartwright. But Ezra looked different in this photo, younger, harder, wearing clothes that suggested authority rather than mountain living. And on his vest, partially visible in the old image, was the edge of something. Something that looked like a badge. Eli's mind reeled. His father, Ezra Cartwright, had been a lawman, had been working with Hendricks. The journal entries suddenly made new sense. James says, and I've agreed, and the boy is safe here. Ezra hadn't just been a good Samaritan who'd agreed to hide a witness. He'd been part of the investigation, part of the law enforcement effort to bring down the McKinnon gang. And when Hendricks died, Ezra had taken it on himself to protect the boy and preserve the evidence. Had given up his badge, his career, his whole life to keep one child safe and keep the possibility of justice alive. Everything Eli thought he knew about his father shifted, reformed. Ezra Cartwright hadn't been a hermit who preferred solitude. He'd been a man in hiding, protecting the most important witness in a case that could topple an empire, a case that was now, finally, reaching its conclusion. Gunfire snapped Eli back to the present. One of Voight's men had broken cover, was charging his position. Eli fired twice, and the man went down. That's enough. A new voice cut through the chaos. Federal marshals, drop your weapons. Eli's head snapped up. There, emerging from the trees, were a dozen riders, all wearing badges. And in the lead, on a grey mare, was Clara, her face determined and fierce. Tom rode beside her, his wounded arm in a sling, his other hand holding his pistol steady. We got the evidence to town, Clara called out. The territorial marshal sent help. Voight and his men were surrounded now, outgunned and outmaneuvered. One by one they dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The fight was over. Eli slumped against the boulder, his whole body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Tom dismounted and made his way over, a grin splitting his face despite the pain he must have been in. Told you we'd wait for you, he said. At the line shack, you said. Not here. Changed our minds. Figured you might need some backup. Tom looked at the photograph still clutched in Eli's hand. What's that? Eli handed it to him wordlessly. Tom studied it, his eyes widening as he understood. Your father was a marshal. Deputy marshal, probably. Maybe working undercover. Eli's voice was rough with emotion. He gave up everything to protect me, to keep this case alive until the time was right. He'd be proud of you, Tom said quietly. Finishing what he and Hendricks started. The territorial marshals were rounding up Voight and his men, reading them charges that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. Clara dismounted and came over to check on Eli, her hands gentle as she examined him for injuries. You're a fool, she said, but her voice was warm. Running off like that. Could have gotten yourself killed. Seemed like the smart play at the time. Well, next time you decide to be heroic, at least give us a chance to argue about it first. Eli managed a tired smile. There's gonna be a next time? With you? Probably. The ride back to town took most of the night, but Eli didn't mind. He was alive. The evidence was safe, and justice, delayed by 30 years, was finally within reach. As they rode through the darkness, he kept touching the photograph in his pocket, thinking about Ezra and Mary and Marshal Hendricks, thinking about the price they'd all paid so that one day the truth could come out. The truth was out now, and the reckoning was at hand. The territorial marshal's office in Timber Ridge had never seen this much activity. Eli sat in a straight-back chair, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching as lawmen moved through the building with purpose and barely contained excitement. The documents from the tin box were spread across the marshal's desk, each one a nail in the coffin of the McKinnon empire. Tom stood beside him, his arm properly bandaged now by the town doctor. Clara had gone home to rest, but only after making Eli promise to come by her place when all this was done so she could feed him a proper meal. The territorial marshal A grey-haired man named William Foster, who carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd seen everything and wasn't easily impressed, examined the ledger for the third time. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, and his expression grew grimmer with each page. "This is remarkable," Foster said finally, looking up at Eli. 30 years of corruption, documented in their own hand. Bribes, payoffs, cover-ups. Half the territorial government is implicated here. He closed the ledger carefully. "And you're certain you can testify about the original murders? That your memory is clear enough to hold up in court?" Eli nodded. "It's coming back. The more I look at the documents, the more I remember. I was 6 years old, but I saw what happened in that barn. I can describe the faces, the voices. I can place each man there. Good, because this is going to be the biggest trial this territory has ever seen." Foster stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dawn breaking over the town. "Clayton McKinnon Jr. has been untouchable for decades. He'll have the best lawyers money can buy, and he'll fight this with everything he has. Will it be enough?" Tom asked. "With all this evidence?" "It should be. But rich men have a way of wriggling out of justice." Foster turned back to face them. "That's why your testimony is crucial, Mr. Cartwright. The documents show the conspiracy, but you're the one who can put faces to the crime. You're the one who can stand up in court and say, 'I was there. I saw them murder that man.'" The weight of that responsibility settled on Eli's shoulders like a physical burden. He'd spent 30 years avoiding attention, staying hidden, keeping his head down. Now he was being asked to stand up in front of the entire territory and relive the worst moment of his childhood. But it was what Mary had died for, what Hendricks had died for, what Ezra had sacrificed his entire life for. "I'll do it," Eli said. "Whatever it takes." Foster smiled, and it was the first genuine warmth Eli had seen from the hard-faced lawman. "Good man. Now let's talk about keeping you alive until the trial. McKinnon has resources. Voight wasn't working alone. There will be others, and they'll be looking for any way to silence you. I can protect myself. I'm sure you can. But we're not taking chances. You'll stay in town, in a secure location. I'm deputizing Tom here as your personal guard, and we'll have rotating shifts of marshals watching the building." Eli wanted to argue, to insist he'd be safer in his own cabin in the mountains. But he knew Foster was right. In town, surrounded by law enforcement, he'd be harder to reach. And if something did happen, there'd be witnesses, backup, help. How long until the trial? He asked. 6 weeks, maybe 8. We need time to build the case properly, get all our witnesses in order. And McKinnon's lawyers will file every delay they can think of. Foster returned to his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. "In the meantime, I need you to write down everything you remember. Every detail, no matter how small. Dates, times, what people were wearing, what they said. All of it." The next week passed in a blur of statements and interviews. Eli talked until his throat was raw, remembering details he didn't know he'd forgotten. The color of McKinnon's horse, the smell of tobacco smoke in the barn, the sound of his mother's voice calling him away from the window just seconds before the shot rang out. Each memory was a knife, cutting deep, but he endured it. He owed his mother and Ezra that much. Tom stayed close, always within sight, always alert. They'd moved Eli to a room above the marshal's office, with a deputy stationed outside the door at all times. It was safer than his cabin, but Eli felt caged. He missed the mountains, missed Betsy, missed the silence that came with solitude. Clara visited daily, bringing food and conversation, and a welcome break from the endless questions. She sat with him one evening while Tom took a shift downstairs, and they talked about nothing in particular, the weather, the town gossip, her plans to expand her delivery business now that the railway was bringing more settlers. "You doing all right?" she asked finally, getting to the real question she'd come to ask. "I'm alive." "That's something. That's not what I meant." She set down her knitting, giving him her full attention. "This can't be easy, reliving all of it." Eli looked out the window at the street below. Life going on as normal? People who had no idea that their comfortable world was about to be shaken by revelations of corruption and murder. "I keep thinking about them," he said. My mother, mostly. I remember her now, really remember her, not just fragments. She used to sing to me at night. Irish songs, I think. She had red hair and she was always warm, always smiling. His voice caught. And then one day she was just gone, and Ezra told me she'd had an accident, and I believed him because what else could I do? I was 6 years old. Clara reached over and took his hand. She saved you. That's what mothers do. They protect their children, even when it costs them everything. I wish I could have saved her. You were a child. You did exactly what she needed you to do. You survived. And now, 30 years later, you're going to make sure her death meant something. Clara squeezed his hand. That's not nothing, Eli. That's everything. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. And then Clara asked the question he'd been avoiding thinking about. What will you do after? After the trial, I mean. Will you go back to the mountains? I don't know. And that was the honest truth. The man who'd built that cabin, who'd chosen solitude over society, felt like someone else now. Someone who hadn't known his own story. Maybe I'll stay in town for a while. See what that's like, Clara smiled. There's a house for sale on Maple Street. 3 bedrooms, good land, needs some work but nothing you couldn't handle. Close enough to town for visiting, far enough out for quiet. You've been looking at houses for me. Just keeping my options open. In case you decided to be sensible for once in your life. He found himself smiling despite everything. I'll think about it. The days turned into weeks. Marshal Foster worked tirelessly, building an airtight case against Clayton McKinnon Jr. and everyone implicated in the ledger. Arrests were made, judges, sheriffs, land office clerks. Each one claimed innocence, blamed others, tried to cut deals. But Foster was relentless, and the evidence was overwhelming. McKinnon himself remained free on bail, protected by lawyers and influence. But even his power was crumbling. The territorial governor had ordered a full investigation, and federal marshals were swarming through McKinnon business records, finding more crimes, more cover-ups, decades of corruption finally coming to light. The trial was set for the first week of June. Eli would be the key witness, testifying on the second day. Tom had been coaching him, teaching him how to speak clearly, how to handle hostile questions from defense lawyers, how to stay calm under pressure. They're going to try to rattle you, Tom said during one of their practice sessions. They'll say you were too young to remember accurately, that your memories have been influenced by the documents you found, that you're inventing details to fit what you think happened, but I'm not. I know that. The jury needs to know it too. You tell your story simply, honestly, and let the evidence speak for itself. Tom paused. And if you get overwhelmed, if it's too much, you look at me. I'll be right there in the courtroom. You're not alone in this. The night before the trial began, Eli couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, watching the empty street below, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Betsy digging behind the barn, the iron chest, the letters and maps and that tarnished marshal's badge, small things, insignificant on their own, that had unraveled an empire. He thought about Ezra, wondered what his father would say if he could see this. Probably something practical, like don't let the lawyers tie you in knots, or speak the truth and let the chips fall where they may. Simple advice from a man who'd lived a complicated life. Tom knocked softly on the door. You should try to get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be long. Can't sleep, I figured. Tom came in and sat on the edge of the bed. You want to talk? What's there to say? Tomorrow we walk into that courthouse, I tell my story, and we see if justice still means anything in this territory. It does. It has to. Tom's voice was firm. Hendricks believed it. Your father believed it. That's why they did what they did. That's why we're here now. Eli turned from the window. And if the jury doesn't believe me? If McKinnon walks? Then we keep fighting. File appeals, find more evidence, never stop until we get it right. Tom stood and moved to the door. But I don't think it'll come to that. The truth is on our side, and that still counts for something. After Tom left, Eli finally managed to lie down. Sleep came in fits and starts, full of dreams where he was 6 years old again, hiding in a barn, watching terrible things unfold. But this time when he woke, he wasn't alone in the mountains. He was in a town, surrounded by people who believed him, who were fighting alongside him. It made all the difference. Dawn came too quickly. Eli, dressed in the new suit Clara had insisted on buying him. "You can't testify in court wearing buckskins," she'd said, and looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back was a stranger. Clean-shaven, hair-trimmed, clothes that fit properly. He looked respectable, trustworthy. He looked like someone a jury might believe. Tom knocked again at 7. "Time to go." They walked to the courthouse together, surrounded by a security detail of federal marshals. The building was already crowded. Townspeople eager to witness history, reporters from as far away as San Francisco, lawyers and officials, and curiosity seekers. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Eli took his seat in the witness area, Tom beside him. Across the aisle, Clayton McKinnon Jr. sat with his legal team, 5 lawyers in expensive suits, all wearing expressions of confidence, bordering on arrogance. McKinnon himself was younger than Eli expected, maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd never known hardship. He looked at Eli once, just a glance, but there was murder in that look. The judge entered, a woman, which surprised Eli. Judge Margaret Harrison, appointed by the territorial governor specifically for this case because every other judge in the territory was either compromised or connected to the McKinnons. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the trial began. The prosecution spent the first day laying groundwork, presenting the documents, the ledger, the wanted poster. Expert witnesses testified about the authenticity of the evidence. Financial experts explained the money trail. It was dry, technical work, but necessary. Eli watched McKinnon's lawyers object to every piece of evidence, argue every point, try to muddy the waters. But Judge Harrison was sharp, allowing nothing improper, keeping the proceedings moving forward. And then, at 4 o'clock on the first day, the prosecution called its key witness. The territory calls Elijah Marcus Cartwright to the stand. Eli stood on shaking legs and walked to the witness box. The courtroom fell silent, every eye on him. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Then he sat down, looked out at the sea of faces, found Tom's steady gaze, and prepared to speak the words that had been buried inside him for 30 years. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The cross-examination was brutal. McKinnon's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Thaddeus Crane, who'd made his fortune defending robber barons and corrupt politicians, approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he cared about. "Mr. Cartwright," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "you testified that these events occurred 30 years ago when you were 6 years old. Is that correct?" "Yes. And for those 30 years, you lived under an assumed identity, never coming forward with this testimony. Why is that?" "I was in hiding. The men who killed my mother were looking for me. Or perhaps," Crane paused dramatically, "you simply didn't remember any of this until very recently. Until perhaps you found certain documents that suggested what you should remember." Eli kept his voice steady. "The documents confirmed what I already knew. They didn't create the memories, didn't they? Memory is a funny thing, Mr. Cartwright. Studies have shown that we can convince ourselves we remember events that never happened, especially if we're given enough details to work with." Crane picked up the wanted poster. "You saw this poster, read these descriptions, and suddenly you remembered seeing these men. Convenient, wouldn't you say? I remembered them before I saw the poster. Can you prove that?" "Marshal Hendricks wrote down my testimony the day after the murder. It's in his journal. I described the men then, before I ever saw a wanted poster." Crane's expression flickered. He hadn't expected that answer. But he recovered quickly. "A journal that conveniently surfaced just weeks ago. How do we know it's authentic?" Reed stood. "Your Honor, we've already established the journal's authenticity through handwriting analysis and historical documentation. This has been entered into evidence." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said. "Mr. Crane, move on." Crane changed tactics. "Mr. Cartwright, you claim your mother was murdered. Yet the official record shows her death was accidental. Are you suggesting the authorities in 1843 were incompetent? Or corrupt? Corrupt, Eli said flatly. The ledger shows payments to the sheriff and the coroner. They ruled my mother's death accidental because they were paid to alleged payments. And even if true, that doesn't prove your mother was murdered. Perhaps she did fall. Perhaps you've convinced yourself otherwise, because you can't accept that her death was meaningless. Eli felt anger rising in his chest, but Tom's coaching came back to him. Stay calm. Don't let them provoke you. My mother died the day after she took me to Marshal Hendricks, he said carefully. The day after I told him what I'd seen. That's not coincidence, but it's not proof either, is it? It's speculation, colored by 30 years of grief and isolation. Crane moved closer, his voice dropping to something almost sympathetic. Mr. Cartwright, isn't it possible that you've taken fragments of childhood memory, mixed them with documents you found, and created a story that you believe but that isn't quite true? No. You seem very certain for a man who admits he spent 3 decades not remembering any of this. I never said I didn't remember. I said I was in hiding. There's a difference, is there? Because, from where I stand, it seems remarkably convenient that all these memories came flooding back just in time to accuse one of the territory's most respected families. Respected? Eli's voice cut through the courtroom. They murdered my mother. They murdered Marshal Hendricks. They killed 12 people on a train robbery and bought their way out of justice. That's not respect. That's blood money. The courtroom erupted again. Crane had wanted to provoke Eli, and he'd succeeded, but not in the way he'd intended. Eli's anger was righteous, genuine, impossible to dismiss as manipulation. Judge Harrison gavelled for order. When silence fell, she looked at Eli. Mr. Cartwright, please confine your answers to the questions asked. Yes, Your Honor. Crane tried for another hour, attacking from every angle. He questioned Eli's memory, his motives, his credibility. He suggested that Eli had manufactured evidence, that he was working with enemies of the McKinnon family, that he stood to gain financially from this testimony. But Eli held firm. Every attack, every insinuation, he turned aside with simple truth. He hadn't asked for this. He'd been living quietly in the mountains when Betsy dug up the past. All he wanted was justice for his mother and for Marshal Hendricks and for all the other victims of McKinnon's greed. Finally, Crane stepped back, his expression frustrated. No further questions. Reed stood for redirect. Mr. Cartwright, Mr. Crane suggested you stand to gain financially from this testimony. Is that true? No. Have you been offered money? A reward? Anything at all? No. I was offered a bribe to stay quiet. I refused. Why? Eli looked out at the courtroom, at the faces watching him. Because my mother died to keep me safe. Marshal Hendricks died trying to bring these men to justice. Ezra Cartwright, my father, gave up his whole life to protect me and preserve the evidence. I owe them better than silence. Reed nodded. Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Nothing further. The judge looked at the clock. We'll recess for the day. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 for closing arguments. Eli stepped down from the witness stand, his legs shaky. Tom met him at the rail, gripping his shoulder. You did good, Tom said quietly. Real good. As they walked out, surrounded by marshals, Eli caught sight of Clara in the gallery. She was crying, but she was smiling too, and she mouthed 2 words. Your mother would be proud. That's what she meant. Mary Marcus would be proud. Eli hoped she was right. Hoped that wherever his mother was, she could see that her death hadn't been for nothing. That justice, though delayed, was finally within reach. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, jury deliberation, and a verdict that would shake the territory to its foundations. But tonight, Eli allowed himself a moment of peace. He'd told his story. He'd faced his accusers. He'd honored the memory of everyone who'd sacrificed to bring him to this moment. Whatever came next, he'd done what he came to do. The rest was up to the jury, and to whatever justice still existed in this hard country. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 long days, where Eli stayed in his room above the marshal's office, pacing and reading and trying not to imagine every possible outcome. Tom brought him meals and kept him company. Clara visited each afternoon with fresh coffee and conversation that had nothing to do with trials or testimony. On the evening of the third day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courthouse was even more crowded than before, packed with people who'd waited days for this moment. Eli took his seat in the front row, Tom on one side and Clara on the other. Across the aisle, Clayton McKinnon Jr. sat stone-faced, flanked by his lawyers. Judge Harrison entered, and the room fell silent. As the jury reached a verdict, the foreman stood, a rancher named Anderson, who'd served on the territorial jury for 15 years. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. McKinnon was on his feet, shouting, his lawyers trying to calm him. Judge Harrison's gavel came down like thunder. "On the charge of accessory to murder after the fact?" "Guilty." "On the charges of bribery, corruption, and obstruction of justice?" "Guilty on all counts." It took 10 minutes for Judge Harrison to restore order. When she did, her voice was cold and final. "Clayton McKinnon Jr., you have been found guilty of crimes spanning 3 decades. Crimes that resulted in the deaths of innocent people and the corruption of our territory's institutions. You will be remanded to custody immediately, pending sentencing." McKinnon was led away in chains, still protesting, still proclaiming his innocence. But his voice grew fainter, and then he was gone, and what remained was the sound of justice, delayed but not denied. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Eli, shouting questions. Tom and the marshals formed a protective barrier, but Clara touched Eli's arm and whispered, "Say something. They deserve to hear from you." Eli stopped and turned to face the crowd. The questions died away as everyone waited to hear what the man at the center of this storm would say. 30 years ago, Eli began, his voice carrying in the evening air, "My mother died protecting me. Marshal James Hendricks died trying to bring criminals to justice. And a man named Eli Cartwright gave up everything to keep both of us safe and keep the truth alive." He paused. "Today, their sacrifices meant something. Today, we prove that justice might be slow, but it still matters. That's all I have to say." He walked away through a crowd that parted silently, respectfully before him. 2 weeks later, after the sentencing, life in prison for McKinnon. With no possibility of parole, Eli finally returned to his cabin. The mountains welcomed him back with their usual indifference, the peaks standing eternal against the sky, unchanged by human drama. Betsy greeted him with a bray that sounded suspiciously like, "I told you so." He scratched behind her ears and fed her an apple he'd brought from town. "You started all this." "You know," he said. She just looked at him with those dark, wise eyes and went back to grazing. The cabin felt smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he'd grown beyond it. He spent a day cleaning, repairing, putting things back in order. But something had shifted inside him. The solitude that had once felt like safety now felt like isolation. That evening, he sat on his porch and pulled out the photograph, the one showing Marshal Hendricks, Ezra, his mother, and himself as a small boy. 4 people, 3 of them dead now, one carrying their memory forward. He thought about the house on Maple Street that Clara had mentioned. 3 bedrooms, good land, close to town, but still quiet. A place where a man could have neighbors without feeling crowded, where he could visit friends without it being a day-long journey, where he could perhaps stop running from ghosts and start living for himself. The next morning, he packed his essential belongings. The rest could wait or be sold or simply left for whoever came next. He loaded Buck and led Betsy behind, making the ride into Timber Ridge one last time, though this time it didn't feel like leaving home. It felt like going toward it. Clara was waiting on her porch when he arrived, as if she'd known he was coming. The smile on her face told him everything he needed to know. "Took you long enough," she said. "Had some thinking to do. And that house on Maple Street still for sale." Her smile widened. "It is. Want to take a look?" They walked through town together, Betsy trailing behind with patient resignation. The house was exactly as Clara had described. 3 bedrooms, good bones, in need of repair, but nothing Eli couldn't handle. It had a small barn for Buck and Betsy, a garden plot that had gone to weeds but could be revived, and a porch that faced west toward the mountains. Standing on that porch, Eli could see his cabin in the distance, just a speck against the tree line. Close enough to visit if he wanted solitude. Far enough that he'd have to make a choice to go there. "I'll take it," he said. Clara squeezed his arm. "Good. You'll need help fixing it up. I know a few people who'd be willing." She was right. Over the next weeks, as word spread that the territory's most famous witness was settling in Timber Ridge, people came by to help. Tom brought lumber and spent his days off doing repairs. The owner of the general store donated paint. A widow named Mrs. Henderson brought curtains she'd sewn herself. Slowly, the house became a home. One evening, as Eli was finishing work on the garden fence, Tom rode up with news. "Thought you'd want to know. The territorial government formally cleared Marshal Hendricks's name. They're putting up a memorial in front of the courthouse. Badge and everything." Eli set down his hammer. "That's good. He deserves to be remembered properly. There's more. They want to name the new school after your mother. Mary Marcus Elementary. They're asking your permission." Eli felt his throat tighten. "Yes, tell them yes." Tom nodded. "There's one more thing. The territorial marshal wants to offer you a position. Special investigator for cold cases. Says you've got a talent for uncovering buried truth. I'm 68 years old, Tom. So, you planning on being dead any time soon?" Eli laughed, surprising himself. "No, I suppose not. Think about it. No pressure. But you've got skills, Eli. Experience. You could help people find justice, same way you found it for your mother." After Tom left, Eli sat on his porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Betsy dozed in the yard, finally content after all her digging. Buck grazed peacefully nearby. The evening was warm, and from somewhere down the street came the sound of children playing. He thought about Tom's offer, about spending his remaining years helping others find the truth, solve the mysteries that haunted them. It would mean staying involved, staying connected, being part of something larger than himself. 3 months ago, the idea would have terrified him. Now it felt right. The next day, he rode to the marshal's office and accepted the position. 6 months after the trial, on a crisp autumn morning, the town gathered for the dedication of the Marshal James Hendricks Memorial. The bronze plaque showed his badge, his dates of service, and a simple inscription: "He died seeking justice." 30 years later he found it. Eli stood beside the territorial marshal as the covering was pulled away. Clara stood with him, and Tom, and a crowd of townspeople who'd learned the story and wanted to pay their respects. After the ceremony, Eli walked to the cemetery on the edge of town. He'd been there several times now, but today felt different. Today felt like closure. His mother's grave had a new headstone, paid for by the territorial government as part of their official apology. It read, "Mary Marcus, 1815-1843, Mother. Hero martyr she died, protecting the innocent," beside it. They'd placed a marker for Ezra Cartwright, moved from his lonely mountain grave. Ezra Cartwright, Deputy Marshal. Retired 1808-1863. He kept faith with the fallen and nearby. Transferred from her plot in the town cemetery was Sarah Hendricks. Sarah Hendricks, 1818-1855, beloved wife of Marshal James Hendricks. She never stopped believing in justice. Eli stood before the 3 graves, the autumn leaves falling around him like benediction. "I did it," he said quietly. "I kept the promise. Justice came, even if it took 30 years. The wind whispered through the trees, and in that whisper Eli imagined he heard his mother's voice, singing the Irish songs she used to sing to him. He heard Ezra's patient teaching, the lessons that had kept him alive and led him back to the truth. He heard Marshal Hendricks promise that justice would come. They'd all kept their promises. Now finally so had he, as he walked back to town, past the school that would soon bear his mother's name, past the memorial to the marshal who died protecting him. Eli felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Peace. Not the peace of hiding, of avoiding the past, of pretending the pain didn't exist. but the peace that comes from facing the truth, honoring the dead, and finding your place among the living. That evening, Clara came by with dinner, a roast she'd been cooking all day, with fresh bread and apple pie. They ate on his porch, watching the mountains turn purple in the twilight, and talked about small things. About the weather turning cold, about Tom's upcoming wedding, about the cold case the territorial marshal wanted Eli to look at next. "You seem happy," Clara observed. Eli considered that. Happy wasn't quite the right word. Content, maybe. At peace with himself and his history. No longer running from the past, but no longer trapped by it either. "I am," he said finally. "I think I am." Betsy, lying in the yard with her usual stubbornness, lifted her head and looked at him. In her eyes, he saw something that might have been satisfaction. She'd dug up the past because it needed to be found. She'd started the chain of events that led to justice, healing, and a new life. She'd done her job, and she knew it. Eli raised his coffee cup in a silent toast to the donkey who'd changed everything. To his mother and Marshal Hendricks and Ezra. To all the people who'd sacrificed so that one day the truth could see daylight. And to himself, Elijah Marcus Cartwright. Witness, survivor, and finally, after 30 long years of running, a man who'd found his way home. The stars came out one by one over the Montana mountains, ancient and indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere in those mountains was the cabin where Eli had spent 3 decades hiding. Somewhere out there was the spot where Betsy had dug up the iron chest that changed everything. But here, on Maple Street in Timber Ridge, surrounded by friends and purpose and the possibility of tomorrow, was where Eli belonged. Some secrets don't stay buried forever. And sometimes, when they finally come to light, they don't destroy you. Sometimes they set you free.